Welcome back. Daniel, thank you once again for your insight into the African Leadership Challenge. Our next topic is a very interesting one. Africa has a history of political instability, and what better topic to discuss here than how to resolve these political instabilities? And that's what Lunga Mantashe, a lecturer at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa, a key activist, a deputy president of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania, and head of policy development and coordination for the party, will be discussing. Dan Lunga, welcome once again. You have the floor. We've got 15 minutes for you.
Thank you. um, Let me first begin by thanking you, the organizers of this program, for organizing it, and greet all the members of the panel, the viewers, and everybody who is part of the program. The problem which I am asked to address here today is that of how we can resolve the political instability in Africa. It seems to me that this is a complex problem because effectively, program directors, I am being asked to tell the Europeans and the Americans to stop giving weapons and ballistic missiles to armed militia in Africa. And indeed, I think I'm being asked to tell both the Nuer and the Dinga in Sudan, for example, to stop the senseless war, senseless tribal war over either the oil or using tribalism as an instrument for mobilization. I believe very strongly that to address the instability in Africa requires us to address an even more fundamental and deep structural problem, and that is the problem of lack of ideology, the problem of leadership, and the state of consciousness of the ordinary African people in the context of the existing political instability in Africa. And of course, these problems arise from the legacy of imperial settler colonial capitalist structure in Africa as a consequence of European invasion of our land as Africans. It was one of our great revolutionaries, Amilcar Cabral, who correctly actually argued that the greatest weakness of national liberation movements was the lack of ideology. And this was amply demonstrated by the conflicting views in the 1960s between leaders of the liberated zones. And those zones ultimately became countries as opposed to being liberated zones in the 1960s. And as everybody would remember, at that time, they were gradualists who opposed the immediate radical unification of Africa under scientific socialism. And so basically the 2063 agenda actually is, it seems to me, a continuation of gradualism of the 1960s. And my view is that we are going to fail. We are going to fail in the next 40 years. And everybody sitting here in this platform will be dead. Perhaps I'll be the only one alive at the time to tell the tale. The other point I wanted to sort of drive home was that the era of the so-called post-colonial period, that is the neo-colonial era, makes this problem of ideology, the lack of ideology, even more complex. I mean, Kwame Nkrumah actually pointed out in his book that neocolonialism was the most dangerous stage and the most complex stage of imperialism. And that is the era that we had entered since the late 50s and the early 60s to date. And some of the problems that we see in Africa reflect the neocolonial nature of Africa. So we're in the era of neocolonialism. Frantz Fanon actually made an interesting point about the neo-colonial era, which we need to keep in mind as we talk about stability. And that was that he said that the leaders of the national liberation movements became what he called buffer zones between the oppressed and the oppressors. So they became the national bourgeoisies, which Toure, the formerly called Michael Stokely, called the most corrupt in Africa, the most corrupt. And so you can imagine that corruption can only thrive in the context of conflict. There is no way that corruption could exist, and there's no way that corruption could thrive in a context of peace, in a context of stability, and in the context of economic prosperity for the masses of our people. So, of course, with the support of the Europeans and the Americans, there is a continuation of creation and proliferation of armed movements and human rights crisis and a humanitarian crisis. Even fascist African governments have crept in because of the support. A person, for example, like Mobutu is a typical example of a U.S. installed leader who who took the life, you see, of Patrice Lumumba, who was no gradualist, by the way, who sought the immediate unification of Africa. It's important to think about where we would be if we had united immediately at that time. I mean here, program directors, the unity from an economic perspective, a unity from a military perspective, a unity from even the perspective of having one passport. It is impossible to imagine how it is that we have failed for over 63 years, program director, to even have one single passport. How could we hope to unite on anything if we can fail to produce a lousy paper for movement around our continent? This is a demonstration of this ideological failure. Perhaps it is not a failure as such, okay? And here is my position. And my position is that everything else, and to the viewers, everything else flows from this ideological bankruptcy rooted in narrow country-bound material interests that were perpetuated in the 60s. And if we lack the ideological understanding of the Africa we have inherited and the Africa we now have, we therefore also lack the necessary premise to advance the solution we seek for our continent. I do want to admit something very importantly, and that is that regrettably, the imperialists have instilled the notion that ideology is rigid, that it is extreme, that it is dangerous, and that it needs to be substituted by pragmatism. And this is precisely what had happened in the 60s, where we had started to be more pragmatic than ideological. So we have abandoned ideology of immediate unity, and we have abandoned the ideology of pursuing a particular economic path, which is a socialist path. Because whether we like it or not, the pragmatism in between capitalism and socialism is basically a skewed idea towards capitalism. And this is why Africa has not moved. And I'm going to address this notion of leadership because it's critical to the problems of the conflicts that Africa faces. But in the meantime, let me make another different point. And that is that the reason for this lack of ideology is the primitiveness, what I call the primitiveness of the mind of the ordinary African on one hand, and the fact that the political leadership of the continent knows and has contributed to this primitiveness of the mind of the mind of the African. As a consequence, most Africans tend to view the world through the lens of the former colonist, and this point was made amply clear here. The mind is trapped in territorialism, in tribalism, and in dogmatic understanding of religion. Properly speaking, the masses are trapped in the narrow nationalist ideologies which serve the political leadership right. And the previous speaker talked about this problem of leadership. And I want to give it a structure. I want to say that this problem has a fundamental ideological structure beneath it. It is not that sometimes politicians lack the will. It is that they don't have the kind of will we want them to have. They have a different will, and that will can only thrive in conflict. It can only thrive in territorialism, tribalism, even the use of religion to pursue these kinds of things. So we tend to think as Africans in binary terms. We think of Africa as 54 countries with 54 presidents, and 54 tribes and more. And this is why the question of language, putting one language in, in having one language as Africans is critical. Critical because we need to clean up the mental structural mess that has been created by colonialism, but sustained by the political leadership class that benefits from the chaos that we see in Africa. This is precisely why in the DRC, you have over 100 armed groups that are some of them organized on tribal lines, some organized coming from Uganda, some organized originating from Burundi, some originating from Rwanda. And what that tells us is that this narrow thinking about conflicts, that countries have sovereignty, they use that sovereignty, they use that territorialism to justify repression, human rights violation, and precisely because they have that autonomy, that sovereignty, they are able to pursue the kinds of things that they're able to do. So because we fail, and this is not my indictment to leadership, because I don't believe in the idea of speaking truth to power, because power knows the truth. We need to speak truth to the people themselves, to the masses themselves. So the mind of the masses does not see or think of Africa as one nation, nor do they think of themselves as one before they think of themselves as tribe and territories over which sovereignty is claimed. Even program directors validating the demarcations imposed on them since the Berlin decisions in 1884. This, I think, is a successful work of colonization that needs to be properly understood and reversed immediately. So, how do we then move forward? How do we solve the problem of the Dinka and the Nuer in South Sudan? How do we solve the problem of the Muslim Seleka and the Christian Balaka in Central African Republic? And how do we solve the potential problem in Tigray in Ethiopia, where we are likely to see Tigray seceding from Ethiopia, even after a country like Eritrea seceded in the 90s? Because what we see is a proliferation of countries seeking independence in Africa, as a consequence, creating a strife, a political strife, a strife of instability in Africa. So how do we get out of that kind of situation? I believe that if you look at the challenges that we see in the dispute, for example, that takes place between the Sudanese, the Ethiopians, and the Egyptians, I think the example of that potentially emerging violent conflict, I think that kind of conflict also serves as a model, because within a contradiction, within an opposite, within a positive, there's a negative. That is a typical example of why we need to come together as one, as Africans. Because the Sudanese in Africa, in that part of the region, for example, think the Sudanese and the Ethiopians think in borderline, mentality. It is that mentality. In the same way, the Egyptians look at the River Nile from a territorialist perspective. And so you are therefore likely to have an escalating crisis, potentially leading to a violent conflict between the Ethiopians, the Egyptians, and the Sudanese. Instead of using that River Nile for purposes of building this hydroelectric project to serve the region and not necessarily to territorially serve the Ethiopians, because the only resolutions to many of the conflicts that we have and the conflicts that are still yet to come is to think of Africa as one, to think of resources like the water resources we have in the River Nile as a resource that we need to share. And for the Egyptians not to think, for example, that they are going to have water shortage problems, and the Sudanese to think that this is and the Egyptians to think that this is in conflict with the supposed right they have over the Nile. Because that is precisely the theme of my talk here, that you can't stop conflict if territorialism, tribalism, and the politics of borders are still intact. Now, if you look at the 2063 agenda, the AU there talks of seamless borders not of non-existent borders. In other words, it perpetuates this gradualism that 40 years from now, we're still going to have borders, but they are now supposedly going to become seamless. So I think that needs to be, really resolved. So I would ask the program director to tell me when I need to stop, because I have forgotten to set my watch now. But I'm going to talk about now what needs to be done at a more practical level, because there are practical things that need to be done. One of the things that need to be done is to cooperate on the questions that may potentially cause conflict. I'm talking about now countries that are not yet in conflict but may get in conflict, like Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. Cooperation is critical, and treating the resource as an African resource rather than as a territorial resource is critical. Secondly, we need to think about, how we create one border, right? It's not creating one border, but scrapping the borders off completely, creating one passport. And thirdly, we need to think about how we engage in a cultural revolution. There is something that actually happened in the era of Mobutu, which was positive, regardless of all the other negatives that had happened. And that was the idea of cultural revolution, to really Africanize, to build an African personality, proud of being African. And that is critical. Why is that critical for potentially avoiding and resolving conflicts? It's because when Africans think in the same way about their Africa, when they speak, for example, one language, when they have one standing army, one passport, and it becomes easy, for example, to go and resolve an insurgency problem in the Central African Republic. It becomes easy to solve the border crisis because there's no longer a border between the Sudanese and the Ethiopians. Because after all, the Ethiopians farm in the so-called Sudanese land, and therefore the Sudanese people benefit when the Ethiopians farm. When the project in Ethiopia becomes a success, electricity becomes cheap for the Sudanese as it does for the Egyptians. You see, and so once we begin to create these kinds of pathways, we make it possible for the unity of the African people to happen, but we also make it impossible to start fighting. Because you've got to remember the reasons why the South Sudanese and the North Sudanese started fighting was on the basis also of religion. There were Christians on the side and there were Muslims on the side, with the others wanting to Islamize the black people. Now, if you create one language, this is already creating a bridge between the misunderstandings on the basis of religion, the misunderstandings on the basis of culture, on the basis of identity, and the basis of all those kinds of things. So that's what we need. We need one border. We need one Africa. We need one economic system. Our unity cannot be based on capitalism. Our unity must be structured along the socialist lines, where wealth becomes shared, where wealth becomes collectively controlled, and where land itself becomes the territory of Africans other than particular tribes and particular groups. I'm being informed that my time is up. I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much.
It's great to have you as part of this conversation because, like you rightly said, you'll probably still be around come 2063. So it's good that we've engaged you in the thought building process leading up to 2063.
We all want to be around.
We all want to be around, but hey, how useful would we be? But see, the foundation of for me in what you said is that, look, corruption thrives in the context of conflict. Yeah. Africa is a conflict zone. There's hardly any part of Africa that today you describe as conflict-free. We see new areas of conflict. Nigeria is, every day we keep hearing stuff. Same stuff in various African countries. And like you said, those who benefit from the system, it's in their interest to keep the people divided while they go about doing what they do. We would like to pause here. Lunga, we're going to have another session. In fact, with every person who has spoken today, we're going to have special sessions where we'll have more time to go in depth into this conversations which we started today. But for now, I'll take a minute break, and when we come back, we'll be taking questions. Yeah, we have so many questions, but I'm not sure time will permit us to take all of them. But we'll just sample some of the questions, and if we are unable to take your questions live, don't worry, we will continue the conversations on our other handles and platforms. We'll be right back.